It's now been around 6 weeks since I last posted a video, and there are a few reasons for this. The first is that in the week coming up to Christmas, having dodged the lurgy for 19 months, I finally caught the plague. Mrs. X and my youngest also caught it, and it's fair to say that it ruined our Christmas. I had muscle aches and feelings of extreme fatigue. Mrs. X had debilitating headaches, and my daughter had an equally debilitating sore throat that lasted for days. So it wasn't pleasant, and I have now, of course, had a complete Damascene conversion about the whole COVID episode. I now believe that because I caught a bad cold, my fellow citizens should now be prevented from saying their last goodbyes to their dying relatives. The government really cares about me, and then I now love Big Pharma. Another reason is one that continues to skewer any effectiveness that I may have in adding my voice to the crowd. I feel that I've run out of different ways to say the same thing. Namely, that freedom is good. Being able to participate in a society that you've had a part in creating should not be dependent on whether or not you have had a medical procedure. That the Nuremberg Code, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the European Court of Human Rights were written for specific reasons. That they were written specifically to prevent the kinds of abuses that we are now seeing, and were not just scribbled on the back of a fag packet by some hand-wringing, bleeding heart liberals. However, another, perhaps more positive reason is that it seems as if we are witnessing the continuing and rapid collapse of the COVID narrative. A collapse that was always inevitable, considering the illogical contradictions that the entire House of Cards was built upon. A collapse that has been accompanied by more and more realisations, by more and more previously authoritarian voices, that we must now learn to live with the virus. Although this is undoubtedly welcome, I'm in two minds about where this leaves us. The conciliatory side of me wants to welcome these voices over to our side, since with more people on our side, the more likely we are to prevail. However, and it is a big however, the side of me that wants justice is more inclined to call these people out for the damage and the harms that they have done, not only to our civic society and the notion of freedom itself, but also to the very real physical harm that their acceptance and their acquiescence has caused. The thousands of elderly that were discharged back into their nursing homes from the relative safety of hospital, which resulted in an effective death sentence of perhaps 30 or 40,000 of them and their fellow care home residents. Of all the things that cannot possibly be forgiven in a just world, it's that. It seems to me that it is, at the very least, extreme negligence, perhaps manslaughter, and possibly even murder. If it amounts to 40,000 people, that's genocide. That's crimes against humanity. If there is any justice in the world, the court in The Hague should be very, very busy for the next decade. And without getting too involved in what we must now call the needlecraft, after the prosecution of the hospital and care home administrators, public health experts, civil servants and government ministers, for the fate of the 40,000 mentioned above, there is the policy of needle-raping children. Administering a treatment to those who have their entire lives ahead of them for a disease that is vanishingly unlikely to cause them any serious harm, and for which the treatment comes with some admittedly perhaps rare, but nevertheless catastrophic and lifelong consequences. These consequences should keep the International Criminal Court busy for the remainder of the century. As we know, only following orders will not cut it, and neither should it. My only reservation about this is there may not actually be enough capacity in the legal system, not enough lawyers, prosecutors, cells or prisons to hold the amount of guilty parties accountable. And that's only allowing for the ones who were actively involved. Sickening though it is, there will be no capacity left over for the ones who enabled it, through their apathy, their complicity, or their ferocious attempts to shame, ridicule, humiliate, cancel, deplatform and fire those who disagreed. Piers Morgan, to give one such revolting example, will not erase all that he did with one statement about welcoming the return of freedom, after having screamed hysterically at all those who disagreed with him should have their freedoms removed. He should now feel the shame. Shame may be the only bit of justice that the likes of Morgan will be subjected to, but we should use it, pointedly. And not only out of a sense of retribution, although I consider that to be a justified and proportionate response to what these people have done to us. Because that kind of retribution, in the absence of a justice that will surely never be applied, is one of the ways in which we can ensure that this never happens again. To forget will inevitably lead to a kind of tacit forgiveness. And in that forgetting, we sow the seeds of a return to this insane authoritarianism. In Scotland, as I write, there are proposals to make permanent much of the emergency coronavirus legislation. Nicola Sturgeon and her illiberal cohorts may be moral midgets, but they are revealing themselves to be the very worst kind of tyrants, wrapping themselves in tartan while they remove the freedoms of their compatriots. They need to be removed, hopefully by the Scots themselves. But how do you do that when your democratically elected government turns on you and propagandises one section of the population to turn on another? That's democracy, right? You just have to suck it up, don't you? What happens when you can't get rid of a democratically elected government that has gone rogue, as ours, the Scottish, Welsh and the wider UK government have? The SNP is electorally secure, despite their support being somewhat less than it has been. But there is a distinction to be made here between democracy and majoritarianism. The essence of democracy, as I see it, is that one has to give way when one loses a vote. We have to accept the indignity of being governed by a party or a politician with whom we disagree. But democracy operates within the rule of law, or should do, at any rate. Majoritarianism, on the other hand, is just the rule of the mob. Whoever wins gets to decide everything. In extreme cases, and this is relevant to our time, even who lives or dies. And that's not democracy, because it is not that, but majoritarianism is what we have been witnessing over these past 2 years. It's just force, nothing more. In a democracy, there are limits to what a government can do in order to protect the rights of everyone. When it comes to things like compulsory vaccination, as is currently happening in Austria, that is a government practicing majoritarianism by weaponising illegitimate opinion polls to turn the majority against the minority in an attempt to rid the minority of their right to bodily autonomy. What the majority don't appear to realise is that by robbing the minority of that right, they are also removing it for themselves, for when their time comes. And once the principle of bodily sovereignty has been discarded, it cannot easily be resurrected. If it is accepted that the government has the right to immunise you, for whatever reason, and in full knowledge of the risks that come with that, then the government has the right to sterilise you, castrate you, or lobotomise you, so long as the majority agree. Taking Canada as an example, they have a government that has only very recently been re-elected, albeit with, as I understand it, a reduced majority. But as in Scotland, Justin Trudeau's administration is electorally secure. What justification is there for removing a democratically elected government? Well, according to Brian Peckford, former Premier of Newfoundland, the federal and provincial governments of Canada have exceeded their authority, as well as simultaneously abdicating their responsibilities in holding the federal government to account. In this regard, their actions are illegitimate and are therefore null and void. And he should know, being the sole surviving signatory of the 1982 Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as he explained to Jordan Peterson in a recent video, link in the description. And he has highlighted one of those rights in particular, freedom of movement, as being especially violated by the Canadian authorities. As he points out, in a sparsely populated country which also happens to be the second largest nation on earth, the freedom to move within Canada is vital, not only to business, but also to the maintenance of family ties that may be spread over thousands of miles, forbidding certain Canadians the right, previously enjoyed, as well as enshrined in the 1982 document, from travelling on a plane, a train, a ferry or a cruise ship, is particularly egregious, and according to Peckford, illegal. In this regard at least, if not in numerous other ways, the Canadian government has gone rogue. But having already mandated the travel ban for the unvaccinated, Trudeau sought to expand this policy by way of mission creep to include a travel ban on Canadian truck drivers who are unvaccinated. Now this is strange, even for a moron like Trudeau, as this wasn't a fight he needed to pick, but pick it he did. Now truck drivers are, by their very nature, independent types. It kind of goes with the territory, the freedom of the open road and not wanting to be fenced in. They're not really your average 9-to-5ers. Plus, due to the relatively solitary nature of driving a truck, particularly over such vast distances, they're unlikely to be big spreaders of a contagious respiratory virus. Unlike, it could be argued, train or plane passengers forced to sit together in close proximity. And in addition, if we are to believe what we're told, the majority of Canadian truck drivers have been vaccinated. So it can only ever have been a minority of truckers that will be affected. Once again, we see the demented determination to vaccinate absolutely everybody on the planet. And so, as with every coercive measure that we have experienced in most of the West, Trudeau was, I suppose, banking on the fact that the vaccinated truckers would throw the unvaccinated under the bus, or under the truck perhaps. And even in our compliant times, there remain many people who really don't like being told what to do, and independently minded, solitary, long-distance truck drivers probably like it even less. But I don't think that Justin Trudeau has ever been a truck driver, and it shows. And what it will undoubtedly show over the next few weeks is that when you piss off the very people that deliver absolutely everything you rely on, picking a fight with them is probably not the best idea the Canadian boy wonder has ever had. And in a Canadian winter with regular temperatures of 40 below, the truckers not only keep everyone fed, they actually keep everyone alive. And so we have the convoy. A convoy of apparently thousands of trucks, and perhaps many more, stretching for at least 30 miles, and maybe much more, starting in Vancouver and heading east to Canada's capital, Ottawa, a distance of over 2,700 miles, with corresponding convoys also converging on the capital from the south and from the maritime provinces of eastern Canada. Judging by the footage broadcast everywhere except from broadcast media, no change there then, the image of Canada being solidly behind Trudeau that was previously projected around the world has taken quite a knock. This really does look like a spontaneous, properly grassroots movement that has sprung up almost instantaneously with little or no prior planning. Having said that, over $7 million Canadian dollars was raised in a matter of days to help the truckers with food, lodging and fuel, with many drivers, without trailers, seemingly embarking upon this epic trek on their own coin. The support from ordinary Canadians by the roadside, in very sub-zero temperatures, seems enormous, and the atmosphere electric. And this is heartwarming stuff to me, and to many others, starved as we have been for any evidence of people pushing back, particularly in Canada. Since Canada is next door to the US, what happens there matters. And since its political traditions are very similar to ours here in Britain, it means it matters to us too, as it does to Australia, and indeed New Zealand. Faced with the enormity of tens of thousands of angry truckers descending on the seat of government, Trudeau reverted to the kind of man many of us suspected all along. He announced that he had been exposed to COVID by a close contact, and he has gone into isolation for 5 days. Does he imagine that the truckers will have all gone home by then, having travelled 2,700 miles? Does he think that 5 days of hiding will be sufficient to avoid them? Mind you, it does beg the question, what are the truckers going to do when they get to Parliament Hill? I suppose the best, as well as the most effective answer is nothing. Even 1,000 trucks parked nose to tail in central Ottawa would be an obstacle too enormous for the Canadian authorities to deal with. But 10,000 or 50,000? And doing nothing really is the best response. Their stated aim, as I understand it, is to remain there until all restrictions are lifted. And they could do it. It will need some resolution as the source of shortages begin to bite, and some will begin to blame the truckers. But they just need to hold their nerve. Bringing down the COVID house won't come without sacrifices, but it'll be worth it. By God, will it be worth it. And the Canadian truck drivers will have taught all of us a lesson. They're certainly teaching me one. And that lesson, to borrow a slogan from Greenpeace of all people, is that actions speak louder. For too long, so many of us have kept faith with our democracy and our rule of law. We thought that the fine and noble words of the drafters of our various constitutions, our Bills of Rights, and in Canada's case their Charter of Rights and Freedoms, would keep us safe from power-hungry politicians. In short, we thought that words on paper and on ancient parchment were enough to keep the tyrants at bay. Now, we know different. Now, we know that the managerial class who now occupy all the positions of power pay nothing more than lip service to our cherished rights. Partly because we haven't cherished them. They guessed, rightly in the case of most people, that they didn't really care too much if their rights were taken away, so long as they remained reasonably comfortable. Take my bête noire, for instance, covert blanket state surveillance on the general public. In the UK, as elsewhere, the security services, led by our professional peeping toms at GCHQ, were routinely illegally surveilling the British population. When they were exposed by Edward Snowden, the British Parliament simply made what had been illegal, legal. Job done. But as with most things, we are partly, perhaps even primarily, responsible for the position that we are now in. Because taking Canada's case again, it took the sole surviving signatory of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to mount a legal challenge to the illegality of the Canadian government's actions. Think about that for a moment. When Brian Peckford, along with all his colleagues back in 1982, somberly signed the Charter, they thought they were putting something into place that future generations would use to prevent the kind of thing that is happening right now. Peckford almost certainly believed that he was handing those future generations a tool to safeguard their freedom. He wouldn't have believed that it would be up to him, personally, 40 years later, at the age of 79, and decades after he had retired from frontline politics, to take a rogue Canadian government to court. And as he points out in the Peterson video, without any apparent rancour or bitterness, which you might expect, the reason that this has happened is because Canadians, as with most of the Western world, haven't engaged with the political process. If I was him, I might be a tad pissed off about that, frankly. And so, because Canadians have, on the whole, neglected their civic duty, and I'm not specifically getting at Canadians here, for we in Britain, and I guess elsewhere, are equally guilty, it is left to a bunch of truck drivers to do the job that engaged citizens have so obviously failed to do for the past 40 years. The piece of paper only has power if it is acted upon. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper with some ink on it. Canadians could have stopped this horror show. Instead, it now needs thousands of men in 40-ton trucks to do what could have been done with a piece of paper with some fine words on it. So that's the lesson. Actions speak louder. But the issue going forward, as I predict will come from the establishment, will be that the truckers are illegitimate. The argument will be that truckers are not the government. that they have not been elected and so are in no principled position to demand anything, let alone the removal of all the restrictions that the majority of Canadians, we are told, remain in favour of. And the truckers need to be ready for this accusation, because on the face of it, it may appear to have some legitimacy. But their recourse is a simple one. Refer to Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, I don't know, not being a constitutional scholar, nor even a Canadian citizen, but according to Peckford, the government's actions are illegal and illegitimate, and it's not only the people's right to defy the government, it is also their duty. It is every Canadian's duty to oppose a government acting illegally, elected or not. So the truckers, minority as they probably are, but judging by their support, not nearly as much of a minority as we are told by the honourable mainstream press, are picking up the slack and doing the duty of every citizen that was too lazy, too self-absorbed and too damn cynical to engage with the admittedly tedious business of local and even national government. They have had to bring a battering ram to the discussion when all that was really needed was a diligent lawyer with a quill pen. Some are saying that this may be Canada's January the 6th moment, with all the implied opprobrium that comes with that infamous date. But I think it may be much bigger and much clearer than that. I think that this may be as big a deal in the Canadian psyche as the storming of Vimy Ridge. So, Canadians, now is the time to thank a trucker. Thank him or her for delivering you food, for delivering you warmth, but most of all, for delivering you freedom.